How and where do members of local Muslim communities come together?
When small local communities of Muslims begin to form in new locations, they typically begin by meeting in each other's homes for social and religious purposes. As their numbers grow, they need to look for a space large enough to accommodate them. In many American cities, for example, Muslims have acquired everything from former storefront buildings to former Christian churches. There they will remain until further growth and financial success permit more ambitious options, such as acquiring a piece of property, having it zoned properly, and building a dedicated facility. Whatever the venue in which they gather for prayer, Muslims call that place a masjid, a place of prostration. The word mosque is rooted in the medieval Spanish pronunciation of masjid. Technically, one needs no specific place for the prostration of ritual prayer. Every place is a mosque, so long as one hallows the space and orients it toward Mecca. But community growth and the requirement of coming together on Fridays for a congregational prayer have made the institution known as the mosque a common sight all over the world, and increasingly in the United States as well. There are now more than 1,000 mosques across the country. Most mosque communities eventually develop a full complement of governing, advisory, and functional committees, with emphasis on a fairly egalitarian form of governance.
How do Muslims view Islam's relationship to other traditions?
According to the Quran, the revelation delivered through Muhammad is not new, but a continuation and reaffirmation of the divine message given to all. The earlier prophets acknowledged in the Jewish and Christian traditions. If prior generations of Jews and Christians had not misinterpreted or even willfully corrupted the message, subsequent corrective revelations would have been unnecessary. In other words, Muslims regard Islam's relationship to the earlier Abrahamic faith somewhat the way Christians regard their tradition's relationship to Judaism. The later revelation completes, fulfills, corrects, or abrogates the earlier one. Islamic tradition regards the peoples of the book as especially close kin. The Quran suggests that Muslims should consider Christians perhaps somewhat closer than Jews, even though there are far larger theological differences between Islam and Christianity than between Islam and Judaism. The concept of peoples of the book also came to include other minority religious communities of the Middle East, such as the Zoroastrians. In general, Muslims are inclined to regard members of other traditions, such as Hindus and Buddhists, for example, as considerably further removed from the possibility of salvation. But views of that sort naturally vary somewhat from region to region. As for example, in India, where Muslims and Hindus often live side by side.
What gender-related issues are important for Muslims?
Muslim tradition places great emphasis on understanding and facilitating social relations according to gender-appropriate roles and religiously acceptable behavior. In some societies, women are excluded from certain occupations. But in most instances those are cultural rather than explicitly religious norms. For example, American Muslim women participate in a wider range of professions than do their sisters in some other countries. Non-Muslim American professional women may experience the same kinds of occupational limitations as their Muslim counterparts. All societies and cultures have their gender biases, and religious sanction and justification often becomes inextricably intertwined with them. Largely because religious argument can be a useful element in social control. Gender-related restrictions by which many devout Muslims abide are largely family matters, arising from the belief that God has ordained certain tasks to men and certain others to women. Gender and sex differences are real, they observe, and part of a larger plan. Traditional family life calls for a division of labor and a clear understanding of individual and collective priorities. Non-Muslims sometimes conclude that Muslim women who choose to observe a dress code are oppressed. Talk to the Muslim women, many of whom are successful physicians, lawyers, and engineers, and you get a different perspective.
Who are the black Muslims in the Nation of Islam?
In 1930s Detroit, W. D. Fard began teaching that the ancestors of black Americans had been Muslims. Young Elijah Poole became a devoted follower, and Fard declared Poole his successor and prophet. Elijah took the last name Muhammad and continued to develop a community called the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims. Two prominent young followers of Elijah Muhammad were Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. Malcolm X tells in his autobiography how he discovered during his pilgrimage to Mecca that Elijah Muhammad's teachings of a kind of reverse racism were a lie. All human beings were brothers and sisters under God. And Malcolm returned to try to counter-teach Muhammad's misinterpretations of Islam. Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, but 10 years later, when Muhammad died, Elijah's son Wallace took over and continued to pursue the reform movement Malcolm X had begun. Wallace sought to bring the Nation of Islam, newly named the World Community of Islam in the West, in line with mainstream Muslim teachings. Louis Farrakhan, on the other hand, chose to continue the separatist doctrines of Elijah Muhammad and, with his approximately 50,000 followers, retain the name Nation of Islam.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Christian worship and prayer?
In addition to the cross or crucifix, Christians use a variety of ritual objects, more commonly in liturgical communities than in non-liturgical ones. the more elaborate the liturgical practice, in general. The more kinds of symbolic and practical implements are required. Most Christian churches have an altar on a raised platform in front of, or in the midst of, the congregation. Exceptions are Pentecostal and similar groups whose primary rituals revolve entirely around preaching, singing, and the ongoing interaction of the leaders with the congregation. Churches such as the Roman and Anglo-Catholic, most Eastern churches and some Lutheran groups feature a ritual that includes some reenactment of the Eucharistic prayer. Their ritual leader typically wears special vestments and handles the sacred vessels. A large cup called the chalice, traditionally either made of or lined with precious metal, holds the wine, grape juice in some churches. A still larger vessel called the ciborium, Latin for food container, kept covered except during the prayers of consecration, holds the altar bread either in the form of small unleavened wafers or leavened cubes that can be dipped into the wine before dispensing to communicants. Another common implement used in more elaborate liturgies is the Thursdayable or incense burner. A small spherical container with a lighted charcoal for igniting grains of incense, which is swung from a chain in gestures of benediction. Less common but worth mentioning if only because of its artistic beauty is the ostensorium or monstrance. A large ornate device shaped like a spectacular sunburst or a small Gothic cathedral used for displaying the consecrated host during special processions or for Western congregational adoration.
What sorts of signs or symbols do Muslims use at home?
Many Muslim families decorate their homes with wall hangings and other small objects with religious significance. Popular items include cloth or paper panels showing beautifully written texts of the Quran. Pictures of Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, or of other important mosques or shrines are quite common. Some families prominently display a copy of the Quran, often kept in a special case or wrapping, on a bookstand or on the mantle. Shiite households frequently have pictures of Ali, his two sons Hassan and Hussein, and sometimes also of other imams or their burial places. Muslim households will not own or display a picture of Muhammad or any of the other prophets. Special times and seasons often call for special religious ornament. Some families put the Quran center stage during Ramadan, for example.
Do Muslims have a system of religious law?
As the young community grew and established itself in Medina, it became increasingly necessary for Muhammad to address countless questions of order and acceptable practice. Some of the later texts of the Quran deal with specific issues, such as how to pray, what foods and activities to avoid, and how to observe basic social relationships.
Do Muslims allow interfaith marriages?
Muslims generally prefer that their sons and daughters marry members of their own faith tradition. They officially allow marriage to members of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, and Christianity. But most still consider it acceptable only for Muslim men to marry non-Muslim women. And then it is assumed that the non-Muslim party will agree to raise the children as Muslims. Among the 8 million or so Muslims living in the United States, the practice of Muslim women marrying non-Muslim men has been increasing somewhat lately.
May women attend Muslim burial services?
Women may attend funeral services at a mosque, though most mosques have separate sections for men and women. Sayings of the Prophet Muhammad recommend that women not attend burials because they might faint or lose control of their emotions. But the sayings stop short of barring women's attendance.
Is sacrifice important in Christian ritual?
Christians generally believe that the death of Christ on the cross replaced the ancient Jewish ritual of animal sacrifice once integral to temple worship. The whole burnt offering known as the Holocaust was offered in atonement for sins. But Christ's death has redeemed humankind once and for all. Christians often speak of the Eucharist, divine liturgy, or Mass as an unbloody sacrifice, in which worshippers reenact symbolically Jesus' cosmically efficacious offering of himself. Sacrifice as a symbolic act still plays a role in the personal spirituality of many Christians. For example, charitable giving, support of one's local religious community, and doing without food or other pleasures for a time, can be a form of metaphorical sacrifice meant to heighten awareness of deeper spiritual values.
What is jihad?
Jihad, pronounced Ghaad, comes from an Arabic verb that means to struggle or exert oneself. In recent years both Muslims and non-Muslims alike have bandied the term about so loosely that one has to do some digging to retrieve an accurate understanding of it. According to news reports, everyone from the scarcely devout Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban has called for a jihad against somebody, usually the West. Hence the virtually automatic translation of jihad as holy war, at best a misleading, and at worst a highly inflammatory, interpretation. Jihad does have a range of precisely defined meanings in Islamic tradition. Under prescribed circumstances, jihad can include offensive military action where the free practice of Islam is under threat of constraint. Many scholars in recent times have held that one cannot justify an offensive jihad unless Muslims are being persecuted religiously. Even then, therefore, we are talking about a type of defensive action. Military jihad has always been subject to strict criteria and is in many ways parallel to the Christian notion of just war. Very few, if any, recent calls for jihad have actually satisfied the necessary criteria. Muslims also speak of various nonviolent forms of jihad. One can battle injustice and evil through jihad of the pen or the tongue, for example. When someone asked Muhammad what the greatest jihad was, the Prophet replied that it was to speak a word of truth in the ear of a tyrant. An important theme in Islamic spirituality has been called the Greater Jihad. As distinct from all the various forms of exterior, lesser jihads, warriors of the spirit must take up the sword of self-knowledge against the fiercest enemy of all, their own inner tendencies to evil and idolatry.
Do Muslims mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Drive by the mosque nearest you. There is probably one not very far away, and you are likely to notice two distinctive features. Attached to, or alongside, the building you will see one or perhaps two slender towers called minarets. Originally designed to provide maximum broadcast of the call to prayer, the minaret eventually became a visual symbol of Islamic presence. Most structures designed as mosques feature a dome of some sort, typically spanning the central interior space called the prayer hall. Many synagogues and Eastern Christian churches also use central domes, but generally do not have towers that one might mistake for minarets. Atop some minarets and domes you will find a finial in the shape of a crescent moon encircling a single star. Some communities choose to have their mosques reflect architecturally a particular national or regional heritage. They might hire, for example, an Egyptian architect to design in a neoclassical Egyptian style, as with the National Mosque in Washington, D.C. Or they might choose to incorporate into the design some visual allusion to a particularly important mosque, the way the new Islamic Center of Cleveland aligns a large central and a smaller secondary dome, recalling the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Interior decorations typically feature elegant calligraphic texts, either painted or carved in marble or other stone, of the names Allah and Muhammad, and of the Shahada and Basmala, and possibly of any number of the 99 beautiful names of God. Calligraphic decoration often appears around the drum of the dome and around the niche on the wall facing Mecca. Prayer rugs or carpeting sometimes show niche designs like that of the mihrab, pronounced mi'raab, niche. And somewhere in the mosque there will more than likely be a large picture of the sanctuary of the Kaaba in Mecca, and possibly also of the Prophet's mosque in Medina.
Is there an Islamic fundamentalism?
Unfortunately, the term fundamentalist has become virtually synonymous with Muslim in contemporary American usage. This is unfortunate because, when applied to Muslims, fundamentalist has been simultaneously linked to terrorism. It is fair to say that most devout Muslims interpret their scriptures conservatively and quite literally, as do the vast majority of devout adherents to many traditions. Islamic fundamentalism is not inherently more likely to be expressed in extreme behavior than any other brand of fundamentalism. One can of course point to examples of such behavior in virtually every tradition, including the assassination of abortion providers by American Christians and the burning of Christian villagers by angry Hindu mobs in India. Extreme and violent behavior that claims religious justification invariably has a great deal to do with predominant political and social climates in particular places and times. Non-Muslims often apply the epithet fundamentalist indiscriminately to widely diverse situations. For example, so-called militant fundamentalists in Algeria attempt to justify their activism on very different grounds than do, say, Shiite factions in southern Lebanon. The Palestinian organization called Hamas, and the revolutionary government of Iran. In other words, while the term fundamentalism has value in describing some religious phenomena, it has become so imprecise as to be virtually useless as a way of describing Muslims.
What is the Rosary?
The Rosary is a popular form of Roman Catholic prayer that combines meditation on the mysteries of faith with the recitation of vocal prayers. A decade of the Rosary corresponds to each of the 15 mysteries commemorated in the Rosary. 10 Hail Marys are said for each decade. They are preceded by an Our Father and followed by a Glory be to the Father. While reciting a decade of the Rosary, one is to meditate on the particular mystery for that decade and on its meaning for life. The entire Rosary is divided into 3 chaplets, the joyful, the sorrowful, and the glorious mysteries. To say a rosary commonly means to pray one such chaplet of 5 mysteries. Commonly a chaplet is preceded by the recitation of the Apostles' Creed and of an Our Father and 3 Hail Marys. The Roman Catholic Church has long recommended this form of prayer as a convenient and effective way of meditating on the Christian mysteries of salvation. The joyful mysteries: the Annunciation, the visitation of Mary to her cousin Elizabeth, the birth of Jesus Christ, the presentation of Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem, the finding of the child Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem, the sorrowful mysteries: the agony of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the scourging of Jesus at the pillar, the crowning with thorns, the carrying of the cross, the crucifixion, the glorious mysteries: the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the ascension of Jesus into heaven, The descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles. The Assumption of Mary into heaven. The coronation of Mary as Queen of Heaven.
What are some of the main varieties of Islamic religious officials or specialists?
Islamic religious specialists are a large general class of people called ulama, meaning those who possess knowledge, ilm. An alim, pronounced a'lim, commonly used singular of ulama, pronounced oulamaah, is an individual who has done extensive study of the Quran, tafsir, exegetical commentary, and hadith, for starters. Some become specialists in Quran recitation. One who memorizes the entire text and learns to recite it in an elaborate and demanding style called tajwid. Pronounced tajweed, embellished. Excellent, is called a qari, pronounced kaahri, professional Quran reciter. Some religious scholars further specialize in religious jurisprudence, fiqh, understanding. Such a scholar is called a faqih, pronounced faqih, one who understands deeply. Because he applies his intellect to plumb the depths of the fundamental religious sources in an effort to apply their principles to daily life. Some religious scholars routinely engage in the categorization of various acts according to their relative legal and moral acceptability. In that capacity the scholar is called a mufti, pronounced mufti. One who issues a legal advisory called a fatwa, pronounced fatwa. Specialists in the religious sciences often carry the honorific title of sheikh. Elder, a term that was reserved for tribal leaders during pre-Islamic times. Spiritual guides of the various Sufi organizations called orders or paths, tariqa, pronounced ta'ariqa, also generally bear the title of sheikh or its Persian equivalent, pir, pronounced pir.
What is negative mysticism?
Certain Christians believe in the absolute unknowability of God. To them, even the Trinity fails substantially to capture or transmit the true nature of what they consider to be a God beyond God, a mystical, indistinct presence. For such believers, God can be known only by following a negative path that treats God as a divine mystery, eternally dark and invisible to human beings. The closest we can come to knowing God is through the love and goodness that is revealed to humankind by God's own action. An early exponent of this belief was Pseudo-Dionysius, who envisioned a super-essential Godhead distinctive from all positive terms ascribed to God. Later, in the 14th century, the English author of The Cloud of Unknowing advocated a negative path to God. Today, the practice of negative mysticism is not widespread, but some Christians find it helpful to imagine what God is not in their quest to understand God as He is. Some refer to this as apophatic mysticism, to distinguish it from the cataphatic tradition, in which proponents believe one can make more affirmative statements of mystical experience.
Are Muslim women required to veil their faces?
Use of the veil depends a great deal on cultural custom. The Quran does not explicitly require that women cover their faces. It calls for modest dress, but some have interpreted one ambiguous text - they should draw their veils over their bosoms. Quran 24:31, to mean that the head covering should continue down over the upper body. In some cultures, Muslim women wear various forms of facial covering. Whether drawn across the lower face from side to side, or covering the head completely like a small tent. Those coverings also vary in texture from a fine gauze to a fairly heavy weave with slits cut at eye level. The majority of women who wear some form of special clothing, technically known as hijab, pronounced hijab, veiling or covering, opt for a headscarf down to the mid-forehead so that it covers all the hair. Some wear a flowing gown, jilbab, pronounced jilbaab, that extends to the ankles. Note that the emphasis is on modesty rather than on some specific style of covering. Muslim immigrants to Europe or the United States from the Middle East or Southern Asia might choose to continue wearing styles common in their homelands, where prevailing social norms allow greater latitude in choice of dress. Muslim women often report that they opt for fuller covering for two reasons. They seek an explicit symbolic connection with Islamic practice and they choose to make a statement of personal freedom from the general exploitation of women that they often experience in society at large.
How do Muslims feel when one of their members decides to leave the faith?
Departure from the community of believers has elicited a wide range of responses from families and society at large. Depending on historical and cultural circumstances. Most of all, friends and relatives of an individual who has either simply slipped away from active involvement or made a deliberate choice to repudiate the Islamic tradition are eager to try to persuade the individual to reconsider. They will likely do whatever they can to support the individual in his or her dilemma. If they are unsuccessful, they will commend the individual to God's mercy and offer prayers on that person's behalf. Departure from a faith tradition is generally known as apostasy. Under certain social and political conditions, especially in regions where Muslims are in the majority and where the prevailing climate favors an emphasis on Islamic religious law, the response to apostasy may be more severe. This may include isolating the apostate from the religious community, or, in some cases, even declaring the individual worthy of death. Such extreme behavior is increasingly rare and is generally seen in the most traditional towns and villages. Though now and then a more celebrated example makes news headlines.
Do Sunni and Shi'i Muslims worship in separate mosques?
That depends on a host of other social and political circumstances. In many places where Muslims are a small minority of the regional population, there are very few mosques. Most of them serve Muslims from all over the world without inquiring as to whether new members are Sunni or Shi'i. Shi'i Muslims who attend a predominantly Sunni mosque may discover that some themes they were accustomed to hearing in sermons, for example, are no longer so prominent. In some areas of countries like the United States, where there are growing numbers of immigrant and indigenous Muslims, people with ties to Iran or Iraq for example, there might be sufficient numbers to begin plans for a Shi'i mosque. The motivation for doing so more than likely will have a great deal to do with ties to a country of origin as well as a desire for a kind of spirituality more in keeping with distinctively Shiite interpretations of history and emphasis on the redemptive suffering of the Imams.
What signs or symbols distinguish Muslim ritual or religious specialists?
There is no ordained Muslim clergy as such, but a category of specialists, known as religious scholars, sometimes wear distinctive garb. Style and color generally depend on variant traditions in the country of origin. Many religious scholars from many lands prefer the fez wrapped in the white cloth, signifying that the wearer has made Hajj. Some, from the Sudan for example, wear a white turban. Shiite mullahs and higher-ranking scholars in Iran and Iraq often wear a black turban that identifies them as Sayyids, descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and her husband, Ali. Size, color, number of turns, and so forth, allow a practiced eye to distinguish national and sectarian connections. Members of Sufi orders often wear special clothing, particularly during their prayer gatherings. Various organizations have unique headgear, sometimes using colors or varied ways of wrapping the basic cap with windings to indicate rank or status within the order.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Muslim?
Muslim men and women sometimes wear items or styles of clothing that clearly set them apart from non-Muslims. Stop by the local mosque on Friday afternoon and you will invariably find men arriving for the congregational prayer wearing long flowing gowns and small knit or other fabric caps that cover most of the head. In honor of Muhammad's practice of covering his head during prayer. Men of Southern Asian origin, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, sometimes wear a kind of boat-shaped cap commonly worn back home. In some parts of the world, men who have made the Hajj signify their status as Hajis by wearing a burgundy fez wrapped in a white cloth. The rimless fez became popular because it was practical for use during prostration in prayer. allowing easy contact of the forehead with the ground. More than likely the women attending a mosque will be wearing some form of head covering and an ankle-length dress or tunic with slacks. In many instances the choice of distinctive garb is related to an individual's personal devotion and desire to symbolize his or her commitment to Islamic religious and social values. Most items of clothing are best understood as traditional rather than inherently religious, since they carry no explicit and uniquely Islamic symbolism. However, many Muslim women and men wear various items of jewelry bearing Islamic symbols. Most common are rings, pendants, and bracelets containing religious words or phrases in Arabic. Some show a star within a crescent moon, a symbol some interpret as a reference to the astronomical signs that mark the onset of the month of Ramadan. Favorite texts include the word Allah, phrases such as Insha'Allah, God willing. The Shahada, names of Muhammad and the four rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Muslim designers produce a wide range of religious adornment and market them through an increasing number of suppliers and boutiques that advertise in Muslim publications worldwide.
What distinguishes charismatic Christians from others?
Charismatic communities are those that emphasize the various manifestations of the gifts of grace. From the Greek charismata, that Paul enumerates in I Corinthians 12:8-11. They include healing, miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, speaking in tongues, and the interpretation of tongues. For the past couple of centuries, Pentecostal churches have been at the forefront of charismatic Christianity. More recently, the charismatic movement has become important to many Roman Catholics as well. The movement is centered around the belief that the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost was an essential grace that allows Christians to give expression to their deepest experience of God in their daily lives. Charismatic ritual and spirituality give practitioners permission to feel their religious commitment by acknowledging that emotion is as important an ingredient as intellectual assent.
Do Muslims believe in predestination or fatalism?
A common misperception of Islamic tradition is that God exercises such minute and perfect control over all things that human actions have no bearing on the individual's ultimate destiny. When Muslims use the expression God willing, they do not mean to suggest that human beings are mere marionettes dancing at the whim of the divine puppeteer. They are simply reminding themselves that God is ultimately in charge of everything, regardless of individual human preferences. True, the Quran often describes how God both guides and leads astray whomever He chooses. But that does not suggest that God is capricious or spiteful. Only that God is God and that lesser beings ought not to take God's sovereignty for granted even for a second. Equally often, the Quran reminds believers how God lays out his signs in creation and in the individual heart. Adding, perhaps you will understand. Muslims believe in God's justice. The Quran insists that each person will be held accountable for his or her actions at judgment. But since God is just, Muslims conclude that human beings exercise a significant freedom of choice otherwise. Accountability at the judgment would be a sham, a cruel hoax to which God hardly needs to resort. All in all, Muslim tradition seeks to maintain the delicate balance between belief in God's absolute power and a limited, but more than adequate, human freedom to choose either good or evil.
Are music and dance important in Christian religious ritual?
Almost all Christian churches make music an important element in worship, and a few engage in various forms of prayer-related movement. In some non-liturgical churches, singing and dancing form the majority of congregational worship, even to the point of having music accompany the preaching. Individual hymns, some lasting 10 to 15 minutes or more, are the largest feature in those cases, punctuated by prayer and testimony from the assembled worshippers. In other words, songs and preaching make up most of the order of service. Liturgical traditions use the hymn form, but also sing set pieces of the liturgical ritual itself. For example, the Holy, Holy, Holy announces the beginning of the Eucharistic prayer, and the Lamb of God is sung just before communion in the Western liturgical tradition. Since the liturgical traditions strive for an atmosphere of greater solemnity, they tend to incorporate dancing less often, and then only of a rather restrained kind. In many non-liturgical churches, the expression of feeling is a major component, so that one can expect to find much more animated movement in such settings. More staid and stately liturgical traditions have historically preferred the majestic sonorities of the pipe organ, occasionally joined by brass, woodwinds, or classical strings. In other traditions, piano is the primary instrument, and even small congregations may feature bands with electric guitar and other keyboards, bass, and full drum kit. In most Eastern Christian traditions, however, liturgical services are chanted without any musical accompaniment. Christians communities all over the world naturally make use of distinctive ethnic and local musical styles and instruments.
Does anything like millennialism have a place in Islamic thinking?
Yes, so long as one understands millennialism broadly rather than as a precise reference to measures of 1,000 years. Numerous hadith, called traditions of discord, talk of various general features that mark a decidedly downward trend in human life. Honesty will be hard to find. Fewer and fewer people will observe the religious law, and violence will rise. According to other ancient traditions, various explicit signs will herald the end of time itself. A resurgence of chaos symbolized by Gog and Magog will mark a radical turn for the worse. The beginning of the final chapter in the unraveling of history. A figure resembling the prophet, called the Mahdi, Guided One, will usher in a temporary age of justice. Numerous individuals throughout the history of Islam have sought to gain political power by claiming to be the Mahdi, most recently in 1979. When armed bandits seized control of the sanctuary of the Kaaba in Mecca. A one-eyed Antichrist figure, called the Dajjal, that's Dajjal, will supplant the Mahdi, luring people away through magic masquerading as miracle. Jesus will eventually return to battle the Antichrist, overthrowing that false prophet and paving the way for the Day of Judgment. Shiite tradition features its own distinctive type of millenarianism. According to the Shiite interpretation of history, Muhammad's spiritual authority was passed along through a series of descendants called imams. In the view of the 12 verse, by far the majority of Shiites. The 12th and last of these imams, also called the Mahdi, went into greater concealment in 940. This hidden Imam did not die but has remained in a mysterious state from which he will return to establish full justice. In the meantime, the Imam hears prayers and intercedes for believers.
What does the crescent moon and star symbol mean?
Crescent moon embracing a single star adorns the flags of a number of modern nation-states with majority Muslim populations. The sign is almost certainly not of Arab origin, and the Ottoman Turks may have appropriated the symbolism from Byzantium. At first, the symbol appeared on the flags of lands formerly under Ottoman rule. But other states with no historical connection to the Ottoman Empire have also adopted the imagery. Popular understanding of the symbol usually identifies the crescent moon as the essential indicator of the beginning of Ramadan, the 9th lunar month. More generally still, the symbol reminds some of the lunar cycles that regulate Islam's religious calendar. Appearing frequently at the top of domes and minarets, the symbol has become a generic reminder of Islam. Much the way the cross has for Christianity and the six-pointed star for Judaism.
Is pilgrimage an important part of Christian tradition?
By about the 4th century, pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become common enough that significant examples of a type of literature called the pilgrimage narrative have survived. Pilgrims talk of their burning desire to visit sites mentioned in the Old Testament, as well as those associated with key events in the life of Christ. Emperor Constantine's renovation of many of the holy places also made the practice more popular. After the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem and surrounding lands in 638 CE, Christian access diminished somewhat, then improved for a while under the Crusaders' Latin kingdom. But during the Middle Ages, other sacred sites associated with famous saints gradually replaced Jerusalem as the goal of choice for countless European pilgrims. The Shrine of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain was a major site, said to be built around the remains of Saint James the Apostle. Compostela came to symbolize Christian efforts against the infidel Muslims in the Holy Land. In more recent times, the practice of pilgrimage to Jerusalem and associated holy places has revived with increased ease of travel. Some Christians also flock to lesser shrines associated with saints or apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Pilgrimage was once occasionally prescribed for individuals as penance for sins. But it has never been a central requirement for Christians as it has for Muslims.
What is an imam?
In Arabic, the word imam means one who is in front. Three distinct meanings are attached to the term. First, and most commonly, imam refers to the individual who leads the ritual prayer in the local mosque. Any mature adult can fulfill the role, and members of local communities frequently share this responsibility. Women may lead prayer and preach to groups of women only. Once local communities become large enough to have the necessary funds, they typically hire a religious scholar to serve as full-time spiritual leader with the more official title of imam, with a capital I. An imam's overall function is roughly similar to that of the pastor of a parish church. He counsels, visits the sick, performs funeral services, and generally administers the affairs of the mosque. To assist him in his work, the community often hires secretaries, directors of education and other services, and teachers, if the mosque sponsors a school. Second, important spiritual and intellectual leaders throughout Islamic history have gained the title imam in recognition of their prominence and accomplishments. In those instances, the title is honorary rather than functional. Finally, the term imam refers to the individuals whom the various Shiite communities regard as special spiritual descendants of Muhammad. This narrowest of the three meanings is applied and interpreted in different ways by the major Shiite groups, 12ers, 7ers, and 5ers. Most recently, 12er Shiites of Iran and Iraq bestowed the title on the Ayatollah Khomeini in a way that suggested a blend of the second and third meanings explained here.
What special rituals do Christians engage in at home?
In Jewish tradition, the home continues to be the center of religious life and education. Many Christians tend to think of church as fulfilling that purpose. As a result, there are few Christian rituals universally associated with the home. Among the few common practices Christians report as important to them are shared reading of Scripture and group prayer. Whether in connection with meals or as a distinct activity. If there is one religious activity that qualifies as a regular ritual in the majority of Christian homes, it is probably the practice of bedtime prayer with the children of the house. This can be a powerful formative influence on young Christians, because they can learn to include others in the orbit of their religious concern. Praying for thus becomes a way of connecting spiritually with the rest of the world.
Is it true that Muslims never depict human or animal figures?
Browse the pages of virtually any publication designed for Muslim readers and you may be surprised at the number of illustrations featuring human and animal figures. Shelves of mosque bookstores are filled with books, especially those designed for children, similarly illustrated. Still, the notion persists, among Muslims and non-Muslims alike, that Muslims don't do pictures. What most people popularly perceive as a blanket prohibition of images actually applies only to ritual settings. In other words, you will not find figural or representational imagery in a mosque. Islamic and Jewish tradition share the concern that inherent in representational visual imagery, especially of the three-dimensional sort, sculpture, is the risk of idolatry. Muslim artists throughout the ages and across the globe have produced a great deal of figural art, even including images of prophets and other holy persons. But their images are so clearly abstract and non-realistic that they can scarcely be taken as the artist's attempt to usurp God's creative power. For purposes of education and entertainment, two-dimensional images generally have been perfectly acceptable. In fact, even the prohibition on three-dimensional imagery is far from absolute, except in the context of worship. For example, Muslim children play with dolls. Devout Muslims express a preference for educationally suitable imagery that exemplifies virtue and ethical values. Under the heading Move Over Barbie, one company markets a doll called Raisin. Dressed in white head and shoulder covering, the hijab, and green full-length gown, jilbab. The hijab is removable so that little girls can learn about donning the proper covering. Raisin's clothes are decoratively trimmed, but she wears no makeup.
What does serpent handling have to do with Christianity?
Several small, mostly rural, churches in the United States have focused their worship life around the unusual and dangerous practice of handling poisonous snakes. They take their cue from Mark 16:18, according to which a sign of those who believe in Jesus is that they will take up serpents. Worship gatherings in these churches involve intensely emotional prayer and increasingly agitated music and dancing. People toward the front of the church who feel so moved will remove a poisonous snake, or even two, from their containers, holding them up at face level while dancing around the room. Some say it is the music and motion that prevent the serpents from striking. Rattlesnakes seem to be the serpent of choice, perhaps because the noise they make with their tails adds to the drama and because the rattling might warn of an imminent strike. Copperheads and water moccasins are also sometimes used. Many worshippers have been bitten, some many times, and more than a few have died. But that in no way deters worshippers from continuing the practice. Ever in search of perfect faith and trust in God.
What does one do to convert to Islam?
Converting to Islam is a relatively simple matter. Interested individuals have typically already done some basic study of the tradition. But no prescribed course of religious education is required or expected. Naturally, most Muslims believe that the more converts know about the tradition and its history, the more likely they can make an informed decision. Before entering into the brief ceremony that renders a candidate officially Muslim, the convert performs the major purification ritual called ghusl. Formal assent to the tenets of Islam entails a simple repetition of the Shahada before any two adult male witnesses.
Do Christians engage in exorcism?
Many readers will be at least vaguely familiar with a novel called The Exorcist, or with the movie based on it. The author based his story loosely on a now legendary series of events said to have taken place in St. Louis, Missouri some 50 years ago. Exorcism has long been available to Roman Catholics as a ritual designed to free individuals thought to be possessed and tormented by evil spirits. Church authorities have very rarely given permission to perform exorcisms, and only after extensive psychiatric and medical consultation. The local bishop appoints a priest known for his sanctity, sanity, and personal strength to act as the principal ritual specialist. That exorcist then prepares to use a set ritual and to subject himself to whatever spiritual discipline may be necessary to withstand the rigors of the experience. Peculiar and frightening occurrences are said to accompany exorcisms. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit priest who performed the St. Louis exorcism, refused ever to speak of the experience in public, except to affirm that he did indeed believe in the existence of the devil. According to the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles performed a number of exorcisms, a practice not altogether rare among Jews and pagans of the time. His actions are the ultimate sanction for the practice in Roman Catholicism. During medieval and even into early modern times, Some people were executed as witches because they proved impervious to exorcism. Until about 30 years ago, Roman Catholic practice continued to confer on candidates to the priesthood the minor order or office of exorcist. Exorcism remains relatively common among some Christian denominations, especially Pentecostal or charismatic groups. Leaders of worship might perform an exorcism as one among many manifestations of the Spirit, by prayer and touch intended to free the one possessed. Here exorcism is generally a very brief part of the larger ritual. A much simplified form of exorcism remains a brief preliminary part of the ritual of baptism in many churches.
What is the meaning of the hand symbol?
Silhouettes of a five-fingered open hand appear often as a motif in jewelry and on staffs that function as standards in some Shi'i religious rituals. Called the Five, the symbol reminds devotees of the five principal members of the Prophet's family: Muhammad, Fatima, Ali, Hassan, and Hussein. Many Shiite mosques display the hand as a finial on both domes and minarets in mosques of classical design. Sometimes the hand was hoisted atop a staff as a battle standard, emblazoned with prayers to Ali on the fingers and the names of all 12 imams encircling the palm. As a symbol used by Muslims in various parts of the world by Muslims of various communities, the hand functions as a talismanic magical device, a symbol of control or power associated with Muhammad's daughter Fatima.
After Muhammad died and the Arab armies expanded into new territories and encountered new cultures and religious communities, the Muslims had to confront countless problems previously unknown. How would they deal with issues that neither the Quran nor the Hadith addressed?
Local Muslim leaders often had to improvise, exercising their best personal judgment and acting as they believed Muhammad would have done. They strove to perpetuate the Prophet's example, his sunnah. But authorities and leading scholars in Medina, and later in other cities, looked for ways to standardize the procedure of extending the application of Quran and Hadith to changing circumstances. They gradually agreed that one could solve problems not treated directly in Quran and Hadith by appealing to the actual practice of the local community or to the consensus. Ijma, pronounced IJMAA, of legal scholars. But since some questions were too new for any consensus to have developed, scholars agreed that one could apply a form of reasoning by analogy, qiyas, pronounced qyaas, that followed strict rules so as to keep the process as free of personal whim as possible. Leading legal scholars in different cities devised slightly different formulas for using the four roots of the law: Quran, Hadith, consensus, and analogical reasoning, some allowing greater latitude in appealing to the third and fourth roots. Four legal methodologies dominant among Sunni Muslims came to be called the schools. Madhabs, while several other distinctively Shi'i schools eventually developed as well.
After Muhammad died and the Arab armies expanded into new territories and encountered new cultures and religious communities, the Muslims had to confront countless problems previously unknown. How would they deal with issues that neither the Quran nor the Hadith addressed?
Local Muslim leaders often had to improvise, exercising their best personal judgment and acting as they believed Muhammad would have done. They strove to perpetuate the Prophet's example, his sunnah. But authorities and leading scholars in Medina, and later in other cities, looked for ways to standardize the procedure of extending the application of Quran and Hadith to changing circumstances. They gradually agreed that one could solve problems not treated directly in Quran and Hadith by appealing to the actual practice of the local community or to the consensus. Ijma, pronounced IJMAA, of legal scholars. But since some questions were too new for any consensus to have developed, scholars agreed that one could apply a form of reasoning by analogy, qiyas, pronounced qyaas, that followed strict rules so as to keep the process as free of personal whim as possible. Leading legal scholars in different cities devised slightly different formulas for using the four roots of the law: Quran, Hadith, consensus, and analogical reasoning. Some allowing greater latitude in appealing to the third and fourth roots. Four legal methodologies dominant among Sunni Muslims came to be called the schools. Madhabs, while several other distinctively Shi'i schools eventually developed as well.
What is an Ayatollah?
Ayatollah is Arabic for sign of God, an honorific title conferred on leading Shiite religious scholars, especially in Iran and Iraq. In traditional Shiite circles, accomplished scholars can attain the rank of Ayatollah by popular acclaim and through the acknowledgement of their peers. Among those of that rank, some are also further distinguished by the title Grand Ayatollah. Of those, in turn, a group of 7 have traditionally been singled out as sources of imitation and are thereby acknowledged as the most influential teachers among Shiite Muslims.
What is an Ayatollah?
Ayatollah is Arabic for sign of God, an honorific title conferred on leading Shiite religious scholars, especially in Iran and Iraq. In traditional Shiite circles, accomplished scholars can attain the rank of Ayatollah by popular acclaim and through the acknowledgement of their peers. Among those of that rank, some are also further distinguished by the title Grand Ayatollah. Of those, in turn, a group of 7 have traditionally been singled out as sources of imitation and are thereby acknowledged as the most influential teachers among Shiite Muslims.
How does this system of religious law work?
Some legal specialists rise to greater prominence because of their erudition, earning the title mujtahid. Pronounced mujtahid, one who exercises independent investigation of the sacred sources. In Sunni tradition, the door of independent investigation closed by the year 900. Making further bold scholarship of this level unnecessary. According to that classical view, the founders of the 4 major Sunni schools of legal theory were the last mujtahids. But in Shiite tradition, the highest-ranking ayatollahs continue to exercise the authority of mujtahids. In both traditions, it is up to scholars to offer rulings on controversial or contemporary issues. If a new ethical and legal question arises, a question of artificial life support or some other thorny biomedical matter. For example, a legal scholar would search the relevant sources to determine whether the Quran or Hadith might shed light on the precise issue at hand. If the scholar found only vague parallels that offer insufficient evidence to make a firm ruling on the new problem, he would then study further to see whether in the actual practice of Muslim communities there was an approach that might solve the problem. If the problem is too new to have any kind of useful history, the scholar might appeal to reasoning by analogy, looking for a link between ancient sources and practice and the new problem. Ancient sources may say nothing about artificial life support, but they have much to say about the nature of human life and about human authority to intervene. On the basis of his research, the scholar might then issue a legal advisory called a fatwa. In that statement he would indicate to which of 5 ethico-legal categories the proposed course of action, say, disconnecting life support in a particular case, belonged, forbidden, discouraged, neutral, recommended, or required. Acting upon the advisory, the parties to the case might then choose to bring the matter before a religious judge called a qadi, pronounced Kaadi, himself authorized as a mufti, to adjudicate the matter. The outcome of all this study and interpretation is called Sharia, pronounced Shari'iyah. The divinely revealed law or way of life prescribed for all Muslims.
How does this system of religious law work?
Some legal specialists rise to greater prominence because of their erudition, earning the title mujtahid. Pronounced mujtahid, one who exercises independent investigation of the sacred sources. In Sunni tradition, the door of independent investigation closed by the year 900. Making further bold scholarship of this level unnecessary. According to that classical view, the founders of the 4 major Sunni schools of legal theory were the last mujtahids. But in Shiite tradition, The highest-ranking ayatollahs continue to exercise the authority of mujtahids. In both traditions, it is up to scholars to offer rulings on controversial or contemporary issues. If a new ethical and legal question arises, a question of artificial life support or some other thorny biomedical matter. For example, a legal scholar would search the relevant sources to determine whether the Quran or Hadith might shed light on the precise issue at hand. If the scholar found only vague parallels that offer insufficient evidence to make a firm ruling on the new problem, he would then study further to see whether in the actual practice of Muslim communities there was an approach that might solve the problem. If the problem is too new to have any kind of useful history, the scholar might appeal to reasoning by analogy, looking for a link between ancient sources and practice and the new problem. Ancient sources may say nothing about artificial life support, but they have much to say about the nature of human life and about human authority to intervene. On the basis of his research, the scholar might then issue a legal advisory called a fatwa. In that statement he would indicate to which of 5 ethico-legal categories the proposed course of action, say, disconnecting life support in a particular case, belonged, forbidden, discouraged, neutral, recommended, or required. Acting upon the advisory, the parties to the case might then choose to bring the matter before a religious judge called a qadi, pronounced Kaadi, himself authorized as a mufti, to adjudicate the matter. The outcome of all this study and interpretation is called Sharia, pronounced Shari'ah. The divinely revealed law or way of life prescribed for all Muslims.